Ask someone to name the deadliest fish, and they will almost always pick the one with the sharpest teeth or the ugliest face. But the real danger almost never looks like danger. It hides in the flesh of ordinary fish, sitting on ice at the supermarket, in cans that have been in your pantry for months, and on raw bars at expensive restaurants. Some of the safest-looking seafood carries risks that almost nobody hears about, and some of the most feared fish on Earth are safer than what millions of people eat for lunch without thinking twice. Sardines. If you had to pick the single safest fish in the ocean, it would probably be the sardine. They sit at the very bottom of the marine food chain, eating nothing but tiny plankton, which means they accumulate almost no mercury at all. The FDA places them in the safest possible category of seafood, and they pack roughly 4 times the omega-3 fatty acids of canned tuna per serving. But sardines have a history that reaches far beyond nutrition labels. The ancient Romans fermented sardines and anchovies into a thick, pungent sauce called garum, and they put it on everything: bread, meat, vegetables, even desserts. Garum was one of the most traded luxury goods in the entire Mediterranean, and wealthy Romans paid enormous sums for the finest batches. DNA analysis of fish, remains from a Roman garum workshop in northwest Spain, confirmed the European sardine as a primary ingredient. That sauce largely disappeared from European kitchens by the 9th century, but its direct descendants survived on the other side of the world. The fish sauce you see drizzled over pad thai and pho in restaurants today is chemically almost identical to what Romans were eating 2,000 years ago. One more thing worth knowing: sardine is not actually a single species. It is a catch-all label applied to dozens of small oily fish from different families, depending on where in the world you buy them. The sardines sold in Portugal, Morocco, and California may be entirely different animals. Sardines are safe because they are tiny and low on the food chain. The next fish is far larger, far more popular, and wrapped in a safety debate that most of the world still gets wrong. Salmon. Both wild and farmed salmon are low in mercury, well under any threshold the FDA considers risky. They sit comfortably among the safest fish you can eat on a regular basis. But the real conversation around salmon has never been about mercury. It has always been about everything else. In 2004, a major study published in the journal Science analyzed over 2 metric tons of salmon from around the world and found that farmed salmon contained significantly higher levels of PCBs, dioxins, and pesticides compared to wild. The findings made international headlines, and the idea that wild salmon is cleaner became common knowledge almost overnight. But a more recent Norwegian study, published in 2017, found the opposite. After the fish feed industry reformulated its ingredients, farmed salmon actually tested lower in several contaminants than wild. The popular belief that wild is always cleaner is out of date, though farmed salmon still tends to carry a less favorable omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Here is the detail that surprises most people. Farmed salmon is not naturally pink. Wild salmon get their deep color from astaxanthin, a pigment found in the tiny krill and shrimp they eat in the open ocean. Farmed salmon eat manufactured pellets, so producers add the pigment directly into the feed and select the exact shade of pink from a color swatch card, the way you would choose a paint color at a hardware store. And if you see the words Atlantic salmon on a restaurant menu, that fish is almost certainly farmed. Wild Atlantic salmon is commercially extinct. Salmon farming feels like a modern invention, but the next fish on this list has been farmed since before the pyramids were built. Tilapia. Walk into any cafeteria or fast food restaurant and you will probably find tilapia on the menu. It is the plain, budget-friendly fillet that rarely gets a second thought, and they are not wrong about the flavor. Tilapia is one of the mildest, most neutral-tasting fish you can eat, but its history is anything but ordinary. Tilapia farming is arguably the oldest form of aquaculture on Earth. The ancient Egyptians were raising tilapia in managed ponds roughly 4,000 years ago, more than a millennium before the Chinese began farming carp. A carved stone relief from an Egyptian tomb, dated to around 2000 BCE, shows workers harvesting tilapia from enclosed ponds. The fish was so culturally significant that it was given its own hieroglyph. What made tilapia sacred to the Egyptians was the way it reproduces. The female broods her eggs inside her mouth, carrying them for weeks until they hatch. When the young fish finally emerge, they appear to come straight from the mother's mouth as fully formed, living creatures. To the Egyptians, this looked like spontaneous creation. Tilapia became one of the central symbols of rebirth and fertility in Egyptian culture, and they sewed tilapia-shaped amulets into burial shrouds to guide the dead into the afterlife. Today, tilapia is among the most farmed fish on the planet, low in mercury, cleared by the FDA for young children, and about as safe as seafood gets. It is the fish equivalent of a blank canvas, carrying whatever sauce or seasoning you put on it. Tilapia, sardines, and salmon are all safe bets. But starting with the next fish, the math of the food chain begins working against you. Canned tuna. More Americans eat canned tuna than almost any other seafood, and most of them have no idea that the word tuna on the label covers species with wildly different safety profiles. The difference comes down to one concept that explains nearly everything on the dangerous end of this list. It is called biomagnification. Mercury enters the ocean through volcanic activity, industrial pollution, and coal burning. Tiny organisms absorb trace amounts. Small fish eat those organisms and absorb their mercury. Bigger fish eat the smaller ones, inheriting even more. At each step up the food chain, mercury concentrates further. A large predatory fish near the top can carry millions of times more mercury than the water it swims in. Skipjack tuna, the species inside most cans labeled light tuna, is a small, fast-growing fish caught young. It averages around 0.13 parts per million of mercury and sits in the FDA's safest category. Albacore, sold as white tuna, lives longer and feeds higher on the food chain. It averages nearly 3 times the mercury of skipjack. The FDA considers it a good choice, but recommends limiting intake to about 1 serving per week. Then there is Big Eye tuna, the premium ahi found in high-end sushi restaurants. Big Eye can contain mercury levels above 1.8 parts per million, making it one of the most mercury-heavy fish you can commonly order. The FDA recommends avoiding it entirely. Same word on the label. Completely different fish inside the can. Mercury builds up slowly, over months and years. The next fish on this list delivers its consequences in a matter of hours, and the side effects are considerably more dramatic. Escolar. If you have ever ordered white tuna at a sushi restaurant and felt perfectly fine, you probably ate albacore. But if you ordered white tuna and spent the following morning frantically searching symptoms you would rather not describe out loud, there is a decent chance you actually ate escolar. Escolar is one of the most mislabeled fish in America. A DNA study of sushi restaurants in New York and Denver found that 5 out of 9 places serving white tuna were actually serving escolar. It also appears on menus as butterfish or super white tuna, names carefully chosen to obscure what you are really eating. The issue is not poison. The FDA does not classify escolar as toxic. The problem is wax. Escolar cannot metabolize the wax esters in its diet, so they accumulate in its flesh at concentrations as high as 25%. Humans cannot digest these esters either, and eating too much triggers a condition called carioria, a Greek term that translates roughly to flow of wax. The result is an oily orange discharge that is completely harmless, but so alarming that Hawaiians gave escolar a name that loosely translates to exploding intestines. Cooking does not help. The wax esters are heat stable. Keeping portions under about 6 ounces is the only reliable defense. Japan, Italy, and South Korea have banned the sale of escolar entirely. Much of the rest of the world just sells it under a friendlier name. If you're finding this useful so far, hit subscribe. We cover food science every week. Escolar causes trouble because of what is already inside its flesh, but the next fish proves that even a perfectly safe species can become dangerous depending on what happens to it after it leaves the water. Mackerel. This is a split entry because the word mackerel covers fish sitting on opposite ends of the safety spectrum. Atlantic mackerel is small, low in mercury, and rich in omega-3s. The FDA calls it a best choice. King mackerel is a large, slow-growing predator that accumulates so much mercury, the FDA says not to eat it at all. But the more interesting danger with fish like mackerel, tuna, mahi-mahi, and bluefish has nothing to do with mercury. It is called scombroid poisoning, and it comes down to refrigeration. When these species are not kept cold enough, after being caught, bacteria convert an amino acid called histidine into histamine. Eat a piece of fish with enough built-up histamine, and the reaction hits within minutes. Facial flushing, pounding headache, racing heart, sometimes hives. It looks and feels exactly like a severe allergic reaction, and emergency room doctors routinely misdiagnose it as one. But scombroid is not an allergy. It is straightforward food poisoning caused by a broken cold chain, and tuna alone accounts for roughly 85% of reported cases. The part that matters most is this. Histamine is heat stable. Cooking the fish, canning it, smoking it, or freezing it after histamine has already formed does absolutely nothing. A perfectly cooked, perfectly seasoned piece of tuna can still make you sick if it's spent too long in the sun, somewhere between the boat and the kitchen. The fish sometimes tastes slightly peppery or metallic, but not always. Scombroid is a handling problem. The danger lives in the supply chain, not in the fish itself. But the next entry on this list is dangerous regardless of how carefully you store it. Swordfish. The FDA maintains a short list of 7 fish that pregnant women, nursing mothers, and young children should never eat. Swordfish is on it. An average swordfish steak contains nearly 1 part per million of mercury, and individual samples have tested as high as 3.2 parts per million. A single 4-ounce serving can deliver more mercury than the EPA considers safe for an entire 2-week period. The reason is the same biomagnification math that made big-eye tuna dangerous. Swordfish are apex predators that live long lives, eat large fish, and bank mercury with every meal for years. Shark sits right next to swordfish on that same list, for the same reason. But shark has a cousin that makes mercury look mild. The Greenland shark, found in deep Arctic waters near Iceland, is genuinely poisonous when eaten fresh. It has no urinary tract, so its flesh is saturated with urea and a compound called trimethylamine oxide that breaks down into ammonia. Eating it raw causes symptoms resembling severe intoxication. Icelanders solved this 1,000 years ago by burying the meat underground for months, letting it ferment until the toxins broke down. The resulting dish, called hakarl, smells so powerfully of ammonia that most first-time tasters gag before the fish reaches their mouth. It is served in small cubes at the Icelandic Midwinter Festival, and the Greenland shark it comes from holds the record for the longest living vertebrate on Earth, with an estimated lifespan of 300 to 500 years. Swordfish and shark are intimidating apex predators. But the next entry on this list is not a predator at all. It sits perfectly still on a bed of crushed ice, and in the United States, it quietly kills more people every year than the pufferfish does worldwide. Raw oysters. Picture a dozen oysters on the half shell at a seaside restaurant, a squeeze of lemon, a glass of cold white wine. And most of the time, that experience is perfectly safe. But raw oysters carry 2 invisible threats that no amount of looking, smelling, or tasting can detect. The first is a bacterium called Vibrio vulnificus. It occurs naturally in warm coastal waters and thrives as ocean temperatures rise. The CDC reports that roughly 150 to 200 Vibrio vulnificus infections are recorded in the United States each year, and approximately 1 in 5 of those patients die, sometimes within a day or two of eating the contaminated oyster. The risk is highest for people with liver disease or weakened immunity, but healthy people are not exempt. A contaminated oyster on the half shell looks, smells, and tastes completely normal. The second threat is saxitoxin, a natural poison produced by microscopic algae during events known as red tide blooms. Oysters, mussels, and clams are filter feeders. They pull enormous volumes of seawater through their bodies, and when that water contains toxic algae, the shellfish concentrate the poison inside their tissue. Saxitoxin is roughly 50 times more potent than curare, has no antidote, and is not destroyed by cooking or freezing. When California required Gulf oysters harvested in warm months to be treated before sale, oyster-related deaths in the state dropped to nearly 0. The lesson is not that oysters are too dangerous to eat. It is that the danger is entirely invisible, and your safety depends on a cold chain and monitoring system working correctly behind the scenes. An oyster can kill without warning, but the last fish on this list advertises its danger so openly that eating it has become one of the most tightly controlled dining experiences in the world. Pufferfish. The fish sitting at the very top of this ranking is one you are unlikely to eat by accident. The pufferfish, known in Japan as fugu, contains tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin roughly 1,200 times more poisonous than cyanide. A single pufferfish carries enough toxin to kill 30 adult humans, and there is no known antidote. The poison concentrates in the liver, ovaries, intestines, and skin. If a chef nicks the wrong organ during preparation, the toxin seeps into the surrounding flesh and makes the entire fish lethal. Victims experience progressive paralysis while remaining fully conscious, aware of what is happening as their body stops responding. Death, when it comes, is caused by respiratory failure. The Japanese have been eating pufferfish for over 4,000 years, and they have built one of the strictest food safety systems in the world around it. In Yamaguchi Prefecture, a chef must train for at least 3 years before sitting the licensing exam, which has a notoriously high failure rate. Serving fugu liver has been banned across Japan since 1984. In the late 1950s, roughly 180 people died from pufferfish poisoning in a single year. Today, that number has dropped to about 2 or 3 deaths annually, and almost all of them are amateur fishermen preparing wild-caught pufferfish at home. Diners at licensed fugu restaurants face a lower risk than someone eating a raw oyster at an American seafood bar. And here is the fact that flips this entire ranking on its head. Pufferfish do not produce their own poison. They accumulate tetrodotoxin from bacteria found in their natural diet in the wild ocean. Raise a pufferfish on a controlled diet in a farm, and it grows up with little to no toxin at all. The deadliest fish in the world is only deadly because of what it eats. Remove that, and it is just another fish on the plate. Every fish on this list started with the same simple question: is it safe to eat? And the answer, almost every time, turned out to be more complicated than the label suggested. The safest fish is a name that covers dozens of different species. The most popular tuna varies in safety by a factor of 14 depending on which species you grab. And the deadliest fish on Earth can be made completely harmless by changing its diet. What determines safety is not whether a fish looks dangerous. It is where it sits on the food chain, what it ate, and what happened to it between the ocean and your plate.